And I just wanted to thank Carol Willis, who's one of my fellow density warriors and really gets it. It gets the importance of the right kind of building in our city. And, you know, it's important to talk about that because we actually believe that, you know, to build what is hopefully going to be a great skyscraper and a great addition to our skyline, that it takes a city. And that means not just people like me and Gregg, but we have a lot of shoppers here, as we call them, our team members who've been working tirelessly on this. Obviously, Silvian and his whole team, because the building must stand. But I think most importantly, our amazing client, Michael Stern, Simon Koster from JDS, who have been just tireless in the pursuit of excellence with us and risk-taking, and have really, I think, been market-making in terms of how they've approached this and other projects that they undertake. For this particular project, it also took a city in terms of a community board that ultimately came around and really actually gave us great support for this project. And the Landmarks Preservation Commission, because this sits adjacent to and intertwines with the Steinway building, an extremely important landmark on 57th Street. And we did get unanimous approval from the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And we think all of that's terribly important because our whole approach to this building from the beginning was to say to ourselves, if we were, as a firm, going to join the Skyscraper Club and add something this tall, this is approximately 1,400 feet, it's a bit taller than the Empire State Building, that it needed to be worthy of New York City, that it fundamentally had to be a New York building, that it couldn't be in Dubai or Shanghai or Mumbai. No offense to any of those cities, but we have an extraordinary tradition here in terms of verticality, as Carol just walked you through, and we wanted to add to that tradition. And what I'm going to talk about, and then Gregg is really going to continue with, is what we believe makes this a 21st century New York building in terms of its slenderness. And I think it's funny that we're using the word slender so much after one of the worst winters in history, where we've all eaten about 4 times our normal caloric intake. But, you know, let's talk about slender buildings at least, because I don't feel that slender right now. But in terms of its silhouette on the skyline, its materiality, which Gregg is going to talk about in detail in terms of the fact that this isn't an all-glass building, it has some real gravity to it. And then in terms of its form. And so just walking through a little bit of that. So if we were going to make that argument to our city, our community, to the Landmarks Preservation Commission, we had to start with really the history of the skyscraper and the fact that our city is a place of churn and change, and that it's really been built over time into the extraordinary kind of vertical expanse that it is. And that, you know, this is a great old Bernice Abbott photograph, and it shows what's great about New York, that those sudden scale shifts, the change into a kind of different technology and a different era, which we now once again face today. And we started looking at the buildings that New Yorkers love. And really thought about, well, New Yorkers aren't necessarily like knee-jerk against skyscrapers. People love skyscrapers. You think of so many movies that are filmed in New York and the great skyscrapers that are filmed here. And we thought, well, what are the qualities of those that people really love? And some of it is slenderness, a silhouette, a kind of thin, kind of piercing into the skyline, a kind of weight and gravity. These aren't all glass buildings, and again, they definitively belong here, and a sense of setback and kind of formation and meeting the sky in a certain way. And, you know, then when you get to Midtown, of course, the Chrysler Building, one of my favorite buildings in the city, many of ours, and really started looking at a building like that and trying to understand, well, if you look to, for instance, the left and the right, the MetLife, Citicorp, other buildings, how much the form of the office building has changed. And so we used to, in Midtown, get these historic buildings like the Chrysler Building, the Shannon Building, again with that slender silhouette. And then, of course, came the post-war era. and a definitive shift in the office floor plate to the point where we considered office floor plates in order to be efficient. They went from a floor plate like the Chrysler Building, fairly small, into something much larger, central core, big expanses of floor and so forth. They got us much sort of stockier, and in some cases some very good buildings, but a very different kind of form. And that started to define the skyline of the sort of late 20th century Midtown Manhattan. And then suddenly, through the course of really this last decade and coming into the 21st century, we saw this onset of a new form of skyscraper, the residential skyscraper, that defined a different kind of relationship with the sky, with architects very well known to us, Jean Nouvel, Christian Portzman Park, Raphael Vignoli, and that these pierce the sky in a different way. And of course, the opportunity there is to reintroduce the slender form, the silhouette, back into the sky in a 21st century manner. And so again, if you look at the typical floor plate of the Chrysler Building versus I still call it the Pan Am Building, the MetLife Building, versus our tower, and you see that basic proportional system that's now that you can play out in a residential tower in a way that it's very difficult to do in a modern office building today. And so we thought about that, and thought about that in relationship to the site of this building, directly adjacent to the Steinway Building, a great landmark, and immediately sets a tone for the fact that this building in some way grounds our work. It sits next to it, and we felt a very strong responsibility. This is Warren and Wetmore, the same architect that did Grand Central Station, and felt that this was a building that we really needed to understand and respect. It has a kind of L shape between 57th and 58th Street, the vacant lot next to it, a very fine edifice at the sidewalk, and a very fine interior that actually JDS supported the landmarking of. This is a great rotunda. It has had world-famous pianists play here. Portraits of Billy Joel hang here. This is a very important place. And so we felt that this was something that we really needed to think about, particularly in terms of our conversation with landmarks. And one of the first things we really analyzed is the fact that there was an as-of-right building, as it's known in sort of zoning parlance, which would not require landmarks approval, that would sit directly adjacent to the Steinway Building if it were built. We felt that it would be quite rude to the Steinway Building in having this kind of a form. The zoning allows this, and basically would block that beautiful sort of ornamental top of the Steinway Building, which is really its kind of crescendo in the skyline. And so one of our kind of formative arguments to landmarks was to say, look, we think we should set this building back, and yes, that means we have to get landmarks approval, but we think it's just fundamentally a better solution for all involved. It means that the building doesn't have its highest mass directly on 57th Street. There's a fairly significant setback, and what that setback allows is light and air to the Steinway Building and an ability to understand that landmark in the round as a full landmark from 57th Street with a fairly glassy but still material, and I'm sure Gregg will describe that, retail storefront adjacent to Steinway, but fairly low, and tries to be sort of deferential to its neighbor because of its great importance. And what this also would do is it would preserve the view, but also let light and air down into the base, and we thought fundamentally presented a better solution. And so we think this is going to be a very exciting space down on the ground. This isn't just about how the building meets the sky, but that one will come through retail, one will experience quite a large and expansive, very unique retail volume on 57th Street. And that very importantly, and in fact we're restoring an enormous amount of the Steinway Building, including extending its limestone exterior. So again, one feels the landmark in the round at the street level. And then retail and then really residential above with residential amenities, and then the tower starting above that. And so that gives you a sense, we're still working on it, of the ground plane. Again, tends to be, it's trying to be a fairly quiet, demure neighbor where you can see the Steinway building kind of wrap around. So we're filling in that facade, so you really get to experience that building, and then the retail in front of, next to it, and then the tower set back. So when we started thinking about the tower, of course, these are famous Hugh Ferris drawings that kind of in some ways portend the zoning code and talk about the power of the setback to allow light and air to the street. And of course, again, that setback being fundamental to the form of the New York skyscraper in terms of buildings like the Empire State Building, Chrysler, and other buildings that we love. And so what's interesting is when the tower got set back in that argument that I just walked through, then all of a sudden we had more setbacks required from the zoning. And we said, well, let's look at that and actually kind of double down on that strategy and add even more setbacks into this kind of feathered, laminated approach to the building. So it very, very gently tapers up into the skyline, and that actually, and as Gregg will explain, that the facade will actually relate directly to those setbacks and kind of create some lyricism in the sky between the material quality and the facade. So that gives you a sense of those setbacks. It's a little hard to see here, but there are any number of setbacks on the 57th Street side, very different from the Central Park side. And so basically part of how this building is designed is that you have more glassy exteriors to the north and the south because of those views, and then more solid kind of facades on the east and the west, where, as Silvian will explain, the structural system rests and where a lot of the kind of material expression of the building finds itself. And I think, Gregg, that is your slide. Thank you very much.
So as Vishaan just mentioned, we really were trying to capitalize on the park view. The building sits basically center on the park, and then the skyline view to the south, and to really kind of make it open between the two, that if you step off the elevator, you can literally see both. And so you've got mostly glass on the north and south, and then mostly more solid, weightier kind of facades on the east and west. And this idea that there's a kind of living zone facing the park with it's 60 feet by 80 feet looking here, and then the sort of more private zone to the south. The floor-to-floor heights are 15 feet, so you'll have a 14-foot finished ceiling in the space. So really quite remarkable, 14 feet high and 60 feet across facing the park. There are some duplex units which will even have higher ceilings. And the kind of typical tower plans, we are still working on these. But really the key thing is that the structural system, it's a standard building. Silvian will talk about it. There are north and south columns here, but really a lot of the structure gets taken up in these two walls, and then the beams and the core that connect across to give the lateral bracing. And so you have this kind of punched shear wall on the east and west. So there are some windows this way, but really we're trying to open up the south and the north. And when we were thinking about the facade, we were thinking, just as we were before, talking about what are our favorite buildings, what are the ones that we love, and we love this image because it's a piece of the Woolworth and then the Geary building, and this idea of texture on the facade, and using material in a very contemporary way, thinking about how it gets formed, how it gets fabricated, how it gets made, and what kind of sort of play of light and shadow and materiality could be on the facade. We looked at, so these became buildings that really were a touchstone for us, between the Bayard Conduit building, Sullivan's only building in New York, Woolworth, where Shop actually just moved our offices into last month, so we're really sort of in a love affair with the Woolworth building right now, and the Flatiron building as well. And this idea of a kind of, we didn't want it to be this taut skin. We didn't want it to be the minimalist box. We wanted to think of what a kind of 21st century super contemporary ornament building would be. And so the materials that we started looking at were terracotta and bronze. And so we started to think about all the things that terracotta could do and how we could begin to use technology to make different kinds of formworks, how we could produce it, how we could really sort of move it and twist it and play with it in a new way to give this kind of play of light and shadow on the facade. And then bronze is this kind of really natural raw material that will patina. A lot of shops' work is really based in materials that are in their raw state and patina gracefully over time. And then a kind of taut glass skin when it was appropriate. And one of our favorites is SOM's Tower 7. And so the idea was to sort of really use the terracotta and bronze quite a bit on the shear wall sides, and then really have the glass on the north and south. And as Vishaan said, each one of the sort of bands of the terracotta actually terminates in the setback. So you could see how they move up. And what we did was we started to take these patterns, these radial patterns that come out of each setback, and use them as a way to take the terracotta and twist it as it goes up the building, so that when the sun comes from the south, it will cast these shadows in the thickness of the terracotta itself, which is up to 14 inches thick, and create these beautiful patterns that literally radiate off of the setbacks themselves. So here you could begin to see each terracotta pilaster, if you will, go up and terminates at the setbacks. And then this will be the kind of shadows that get cast because the terracotta moves as it goes up vertically. And this is, are there 21 different shapes or 22? How many? I can't remember. 30. Oh, 30. Oh, we upped it. Sorry, Michael. That might cost more money. So anyway, you see the different patterns. So these are the different shapes of the terracotta when they're laid on top of each other. And as each panel goes up, it begins to rotate to give you this play of light and shadow. And then between, let me go back, and then between the terracotta is this kind of bronze filigree. So it's almost as if the terracotta is pulling apart, and you have this lightweight bronze filigree that sort of becomes this sinewy tissue between the sort of massive, heavy, weighty terracotta. And so these are just some of the patterns. We're still working on exactly what they'll be, and we're trying hundreds of different types. But you begin to see, this is the one that we're sort of really in love with right now, where you've got this bronze piece that literally caps the end of the terracotta and pulls across, and then your windows sit in between those pieces on the east and west. Here you can see the terracotta as the shadow elements rotate in and out, and it pulls this apart. These are full-scale mock-ups that we're doing of these are our CNC cut out of foam, so they're at full scale, and so we've made all the parts and we're looking at them and how they rotate, but you really get a sense of the curvatures that you get that give you the radial pattern. And then that will be when you're looking, this is looking west on 57th Street, so you'll see that during the day. When the sun is coming from the south, it will hit the east and west facades and give this, this play of light and shadow. And then on the park side, it's really about opening up the view to the park. So there we went with a much more sort of glass facade. But to not make it just a taut skin, we actually have bronze reveals that go in between each floor, basically at the beam line, so that it goes from when it's turning the corner to hit the terracotta, it's totally tight, and then as you get towards the center, the bronze reveals get deeper, and then they taper out again on each side. And what it almost does is it gives almost a feeling that the building is curved, even though it's a flat surface, with a nice shadow going across each one. And so here, this is from, I guess, in the park, where you would see the bronze and terracotta on the side and the taut glass facade to the south, to the north. And then on the city, we took the bronze and did vertical fins. So following the same pattern where it gets sort of wider as you go towards the middle. So now these are just bronze elements that sort of sit out in front of the in front of the glass, and really sort of accentuate the verticality when you're looking at it from 57th Street. And you can see as the building tapers all the way up to the top, This would be on the setback terraces. The terracotta, it's almost a finial, comes past as it terminates and breaks down. Here are your bronze fins as they come up past your setback terrace. And here you can see it from the southwest. Again, here's the south facade and the turning of the corner with the terracotta, and as it feathers out and meets the sky. And that is the view from the park. And then there's really at the top, we're working on the whole top of the building with a series of folded glass and bronze elements that really almost become like a piece of sculpture, so that when you're in the park, go back, the light will come through from the south and really illuminate that top as this kind of art piece, if you will, where the building sort of just dissipates as it comes up to the sky. And I think that's where we are. And Silvian, were you going to speak?
Good evening. I'm lucky in a way that I never have to say what's my name because of my accent. Everybody knows me. So, but in any event, the name was mentioned. My name is Silvian Marcus, and I would like to get into 3 housekeeping issues. Number 1, I want to thank Carol Willis for the superb evening that she organized. And I want to say that Carol, she started the Skyscraper Museum by herself. She put a lot of energy, and we all were familiar with all the nice buildings in New York. We all have seen them, but until Carol came and brought to light what we have, we never recognized that. As it's a saying in Aramaic, they say, many people look, but very few people see. Well, Carol was the one that she have seen the things, and thank you, Carol. The second item was mentioned my name with many buildings. Some of them you can see on the screen. Well, that's not one-man job. We are like 150 people, and I want to recognize my partner that is here, Ahmed Rahimian, that we worked very hard for 111 West 57th Street, as well as on the other buildings. And also the people that work on this particular building, like Cynthia Liu, Radhika Kestenband, and Fatih, that it's running the analysis. So that's a picture that our marketing asked me to place. So since tomorrow I have to go to work, I have to present it. But as you can see, it's the Freedom Tower, it's MoMA Tower, it's the Beekman or 8th Spruce Street, it's the Four Seasons Hotel at 99 Church. And then it's our famous building that we are here tonight. And the last one is Nakhil Tower in Dubai. That, as a matter of fact, Ahmad Rahimian worked on it. It's going to be the tallest building when it will be built, over 1 kilometer height. That means in excess of 3,700 feet tall building. The foundations were built, but then Mr. Nakhil ran out of money, I guess. But he's invested a lot of money on the foundation, so one day he will continue. The building itself, one building, contains 16 million square foot, just to get an idea. The last thing related to the housekeeping is that I counted how many times the word slender was said tonight. 24 times. That happened to be we are going to talk about the slender buildings. But 24 times, it's exactly the ratio between the height and the width of the building. It's a coincidence, probably. Well, was mentioned, and I don't want to repeat, but the old Twin Towers, that was the largest in the world at the time, it had a slenderness ratio of 7. And the slenderness is dividing the height by the narrow width. And the engineer recognized the number of the slenderness numbers, but until 2008, when the new building code came in, they differentiate and they said whatever is larger than 7 is called a slender tower. Whatever is less than 7 is not slender. Well, doesn't mean that we don't look at the buildings that have a smaller ratio. We treat them with full seriously. But when it's larger than 7, we take a second look. To compare, were made comparisons, and I like the one with the rule, but I was thinking for a second while Carol was talking, if I will take a person, I don't want to say a lady, because, that it's like 5 foot 10 inches tall, that's 70 inches in height, and if I divide by 7, the slenderness ratio of this person will be that it's 10. So imagine that I need like a 10-inch person that will have a slenderness ratio of 7. But it's not applicable to people because we don't know exactly where to measure. But it's interesting to know. So what means a slender building? The code refers to slenderness only in terms of the strength. The codes in general, they are concerned with the safety of the people. What will be the strength of and the stresses in the various members of the structure. But beyond that, the code, it's irrelevant, like how the people will feel inside. That's not their business. As long as they are safe, that's the most important thing. And that's our job. And we heard the architects talking about their dream. Soon you will hear the developer also. He has also a dream. And we are the one to make this dream a reality in what the people that are going to use this slender building to come and to feel like home, not to be reminded every day or every 10 days or every month that we are in the slender building. What does it mean? It's the movement of the building. It's the lateral movement of the building. And that's a factor that it's a very important one in the slender buildings. And in our area on the East Coast, the force that it's acting and makes the building move laterally, it's the wind. So the wind blows against the building, and there are very many factors that influence the wind shape and the wind pressure. And that's what we are looking at, the wind flow and how the shape of the building and the environment influence the building behavior. So, for example, if the building is a rectangular shape, this is a plan what you are looking at, and the wind blows in the back of the building, in the opposite side of the pressure, it's formed what is called a vortex. What is a vortex is because of the flow of the wind of the wind, it's creating a suction. So the structure itself, it has two items that has to stand against. One is the direct wind pressure, and the second one is the suction created by the same wind. Well, that's the reason that we thought maybe to change the shape. What will be an ideal shape of the building in terms of the wind? And the very ideal shape will be a round building, because the wind flows around the circular shape, and the vortex beyond the building is very small, because there is nothing to oppose the wind. The wind is going through. So these are the ways that, I mean, these are the enemies of the slender building, is the wind. In the West Coast, we have seismic movements, so they are a different nature. But even there, we check against the wind, and we'll talk about in a second. So what are the specific factors to consider? It's, as I said before, are the dynamic movements. Dynamic movements, it's what we are calling, it's the acceleration. And the acceleration, we are very concerned in terms of that we want to create the comfort of the user to feel in this very slender building as comfortable as in any other building, like a small building or like a tall building that is not as slender as this one or another one. The second item that we are concerned with, in these very slender buildings, as Vishaan, I believe that he was showing very representative, it's that the floor area is very small. So now, in order to make the building strong enough, if we are going to implode it with columns and walls, will not be room to place a bed or a table. So we have to be very concerned how we place the material to make the building strong, but to create the maximum space. And the last one is that the developer has to build something that he can afford. So we have to create a structure that is a simple one, that can go, in New York, it's what is called a cycle of construction, and it's like a 2-day cycle. It's a term that is commonly used. In other words, every second day, it's another floor that is poured. Obviously, if it's not simple, you cannot do it, so it's more expensive. Now, we mentioned the first one is the acceleration. Now, what is the acceleration? It's the change in velocity. Whenever it's a change in velocity, we have an acceleration. When we are in a car and we push the pedal, we feel something in the back pushing us. It's a force. The force is determined like the Newton formula, whoever remembers in physics, the force is equal to the mass times the acceleration. In our case, we measure the acceleration in terms of the free body acceleration, that is 32.2 feet per second square or 9.82 meter per second square. And that's the acceleration that we are measuring. So to give you some examples, if you are in a plane that takes off, the acceleration, it's like half of the falling body, that we call it g, the little g. So we call it, what is the acceleration? Half a g. If you are in a fighter jet, the g is 3 g's. Now, what does it mean? The g times the weight of our body is the force that we are being pushed with. So if we have 1 g, or half a g like in a plane, and our weight is 150 pounds, then the force is 75 pounds that we are being pushed. In a car, the same way. If we brake the car, we go on a 60 mile per hour, and we go down in 5 seconds to a stop, we have a very strong acceleration. We have a force that is pushing us forward, and it could be equal to somewhere about 3/4 of a G. So will be a good part of our weight will be the force that we go forward. So that's what they have the belts that it's holding us against going forward. So we are mentally, we accept movements and we accept force if we are in a plane or if we are in a boat or if we are in a bike, whatever. However, if we are home in bed or eating and we see outside that it's a windy day, we do not accept the movements. We are home. We expect to be relaxed and to have full comfort and not to feel anything. And that's the issue that people start developing. What will be the number that people will accept? So they had studies like the wind tunnel people. They were the one that pioneered like 30, 40 years ago. And they took like 1,000 people and they measure and they put them in an oscillator, something, a simulator, and they asked them, do you feel, you don't feel, and so forth. So they came with certain numbers. Again, these numbers are not code numbers, but they are our numbers that we are living with in order to create 5. Always I have this problem, but okay. Sorry for that. So they created these numbers. The acceleration that they are calling is called in milli-G. 1 milli-G is 1,000th of a G, because they want the sensitivity of the people to be measured very accurate, in a very accurate way. And they took the wind once in 10 years, and they said that for how I don't know. No. Anyhow, you see the green one on the right side, it says 10 years, and the acceleration is anywhere between 15 milli-G to 18 milli-G. Obviously, for you, looks numbers that they don't mean too much. But translating again to a car or to an airplane, it's something in the vicinity that 50 times less or 60 times less than the acceleration that you'll feel in a car or in an airplane. So it's very small, and this one covers about 90% of the population. 10% we let them feel, and it's only at the top of the building. And believe it or not, I was in the simulator, and I try excessive acceleration, and I was with some other people, very sensitive. Nobody in reality feels it. And if we are in this number of 18 milli-G that we are looking for in 10 years, we are over there. Our job on the Steinway Tower, just for your information, it's like 60% of this value. In other words, we are much better than any other one built in with these constraints. We are also concerned with the acceleration that returns once in 1 year, that it's the one to the left. I don't know how to make the light here. Where is the net? Okay, I got it. Okay, thank you.
Let's get to the building, okay.
I'm sorry?
Get to the building. Oh, the pointer?
Yeah, no, it's okay, it's okay.
Right.
Thanks.
Do the building.
All right. So here we check it at 1 year. In other words, it's not so speedier wind, and the acceleration is much smaller. We also check it at 1 month. Well, how we accomplish these limits of acceleration? By creating a building that has rigidity, that it's a strong building. Believe it or not, another factor that is very important is what is called generalized mass. In other words, the weight. And you will see soon a comparison between the rigidity, the stiffness, what we call, and the generalized mass. And then the third way to do it, there is a natural damping that we will talk in a second, and also auxiliary system that are also dampers, that are various types of dampers. And the last one is the porosity of or confusing the wind. And then we come back to the shape that I show you, the round shape, where the building can flow freely, as opposed to the rectangular one. Now, the rigidity, we measure the rigidity by what is called the period of the building. The building is like a pendulum. So the time that takes to do a full cycle, we call the period. And if the period is a short period, the building is very rigid. So usually when we talk among ourselves, how rigid is the building? You will hear engineers saying, oh, it's 5 seconds. 5 seconds, very good. 8 seconds, not so good. However, we got to the upper number, 11, 13 seconds. It's again good because it takes a longer time to do the cycle. In this graph, we can see a comparison, what we talked before, between the rigidity and the weight. As a matter of fact, what we call it, the general mass, is the weight of the building. And reminds me of a joke in college when I had a skinny guy, a very tall guy, that we were laughing that in a windy day he has put stones in his pockets in order to fly. So the mass is very important. So here is the point one stiffness or rigidity or strength, and the other one is the general mass. And these curves are the accelerations. So we can see here 43 milli-G, 41 milli-G, 30, whatever it is. Now, in order to get from 41, I will finish in a second, from 41 to 39, we'll go, okay.
20 minutes.
All right, okay. Well, the architects took too long. Anyhow, just for you to know, the general mass is very important, the weight of the building for the stability of the building. The damper is something like a shock absorber of the building. The better the damper is, the acceleration of the building is smaller. And we achieve the damper its own natural due to the friction inside the concrete, but we also have auxiliary dampers. Now, the last thing that we said, that we make the building rigid, we put a lot of material in order to minimize the acceleration, but by the end of the day, we have to create a plate that will be usable. This is a lower floor in what, as was said before, we have a central core. The central core is housing the elevator and the stairs, and then we have 2 walls. But because the total size is very small, we have to engage the entire building to act together. Otherwise, the core itself cannot make the job. By the way, the core also has the plus in terms of safety of people, being able to exit them these walls are like 2 foot thick, very solid walls. So nothing can happen to the people that will have to get out in emergency. The connection between the core and the outside building is done at the mechanical level, where we connect with walls. It's our only machinery, nobody cares. And here is the upper. No people care inside because of the, you got it. And that's the upper floor, that you can see the simplicity of the structure, and you can see that outside of the core walls and the two extreme and 4 columns, there's the entire structure. Then we talk about the tune mass damper. That's the damping, that's the shock absorber of the building. That's the one that brings us to the numbers of the millage that we were talking before. And here is the total, these are the total events that take place in terms of the structure. We talk about the porosity. It's the fact that the wind has to flow through. The mechanical floors that are in any event there. So we capitalize by connecting the core to the outside perimeter. And in addition to that, we have twice what is called open floors, in what the wind goes out in a similar way like with the circle, if you remember, and the flow of the wind. That's the flow of the wind in the open floors. And you can see them on the side, one open floor, another open floor. And this is the porosity that we try in the wind tunnel studies to see how they react, and we had very good results. That's a model in the wind tunnel that we performed on the building. And this is the tuned mass damper. That's a weight that is at the top of the building. And we have one, the red one, it's about 850 tons, and the blue one, it's about 350 tons. And they are suspended by all kinds of machinery. Now, the reason that the red one is heavier is because in the east-west direction, the wind is stronger, applies on the building. And the blue one is lighter for the north-south direction. So all this is being calibrated. Now, can we have a little video, 2 seconds video, can you apply it?
Silvian, no, we have to stop because we have no time for the discussion with Michael.
Okay. So imagine that this was the movement. Just no video. This is the movement. And thank you very much.
Stay up here. Thank you.
Always
Okay, the lights are going to come on, and we'll bring some chairs out. In the meantime, I'm going to introduce Michael Stern. If we can get organized for the discussion, we have about 15 minutes. So, Michael Stern is anybody moving chairs? If not, Nick, maybe you can do that. Michael Stern is the managing partner of JDS Development Group, which with its partner PMG, the Property Management Group, is developing and constructing 111 West 57th Street. Michael is 34 or 35, according to the most recent articles in the newspapers I checked. And he is a kind of wunderkind in the development world. JDS Development Group is a real estate company that Michael formed to purchase and develop luxury residential real estate. JDS has developed and constructed over 4 million square feet of property in New York and in Miami. He's built a lot in Florida before he came back to New York, having been born in Long Island. And so over these last several years, there's been an extraordinary amount of work that they've accomplished, and also, it should be mentioned, counter-cyclically. Thank you. With his partner PMG, JDS has recently completed the Walker Tower, a condominium in Chelsea that adapted the 1920s setback skyscraper built for the New York Telephone Company by Ralph Walker. And they've converted this into luxury residences that have been stunning the market with the recent sales, and reported in contract recently was the penthouse for $50 million. In addition to the extraordinary 111 West 57th Street, Michael and JDS are developing with Shop as the designer a pair of high-end residential towers, a pair of them literally connected by a swimming pool and other amenities on First Avenue and the East River in about 35th and 6th Street. Are you going to come up onto the stage? So Gregg is going to come up, and Silvian, you're supposed to stay here. And I'm going to sit over there. I guess we all have microphones. We will have a bit of discussion. Vishaan had to leave for a conference call. Silvian, are you going to come back up? Yeah, that was the idea. 4 chairs. Does anyone want water before? You're good? Okay. So, I need to pass that around. Thank you for coming. So, I guess we need to talk into these. So, Michael, you want to tell us a little bit about your inspiration for this project?
Honestly, my inspiration for this project was Gregg and Vishaan, who's not here at the moment. But we really like, you mentioned Walker Tower, and what really excites us is the opportunity to do a project that has a juxtaposition of the old and new. So we have this DNA of the classic Warren and Wetmore Steinway building, and we really we set out to do a tower that was very complementary to the landmark, but not trying to mimic it in a way that was disingenuous. And we really challenged Gregg and his team to come up with a design that achieved that, and also, had to garner the support of the community. And I think it's really the first 1,400-foot tall building that got both the unanimous community board approval and unanimous landmarks approval, which in this city is, I think, a massive accomplishment. And we were able to do it in a space of about 3 months, which we're incredibly proud of, because we really formulated a compelling argument for the better building. So we're really excited to do this project, and the team at Shop and the entire design team has been amazing.
Can you talk a little bit about the site assembly and just how long you had your eye on this property? One of the points that the exhibition makes is about FAR, zoning and air rights, and how accumulating air rights in an as-of-right development project is a kind of invisible monopoly in New York, a monopoly game. And I think there's really something new that's happened in terms of stretching the air rights when we think of the square footage, stretching them up into the sky, into these kind of periscope buildings to look at the park.
Well, first of all, I think that, all the easy deals that are just simple, that you go and buy them and build a building, those deals don't really exist in New York anymore. We're a fully built up city. And the story of this assemblage, which was an assemblage that happened in several pieces over a couple of years, we had originally bought the vacant lot with our partner, Property Markets Group, and Kevin Maloney, who's co-developing the property with us. We originally bought a vacant lot, and we were going to build. We had full approvals. We bought the job. We were literally 30 days away from breaking ground on a 700-foot tall tower that was just on the vacant lot, a much smaller tower, and actually a much more inefficient tower. So this building's, got relatively small floor plates compared to some other buildings, but the floor plates actually at almost 5,000 square feet, pretty gracious for one floor, a single unit. The building we were going to break ground on was much more inefficient. And when the Steinway building became available, we really realized that the sum was greater than the parts, and we aggressively pursued it. We probably paid a price that on its face, without the vacant lot, seemed very high, but when you put the assemblage together, it was actually quite a good basis for what we were able to do. So it took a couple of years, and it wasn't an as-of-right assemblage. We required a discretionary approval from landmarks. So, this is the way that assemblages are happening in New York today. They take a long time. If you look up and down the 57th Street corridor, 157 took over 10 years to put that assemblage together. The Park Lane's been on and off the market for 7 or 8 years that I know of. All these projects really took a decade to assemble, or 7 years to assemble. And I don't think you really see very many more of them. I think maybe 1 or 2, that's it.
Well, since you haven't had a chance to speak that much, and I have so many questions, at what, and feel free to jump in. So at what point did you think about the slenderness strategy? Were you looking at other examples like 432 Park or 157? I mean, what changed your thinking?
Well, we really weren't focusing on necessarily slenderness. Our focus was how could we get the best, most efficient, most marketable, most gracious floor plate that commanded the best views. So for us, that was basically a few of the moves we made to achieve that. Our first residential floor in the tower was roughly 260 feet in the air. We raised the residential in the tower above a very large atrium to achieve those views. We went with very tall ceilings. We have 15'6" deck heights. As Gregg mentioned, we have 14-foot clear ceilings in the units, which helps us achieve the height and adds to the slenderness. But it started really with how do we get the best floor plate? How do we get the best ceiling height? How do we command the best views? How do we make the building beautiful? And we happen to end up with a building that is an extremely slender building, but it has all the features and all the characteristics that a great residential building has, and that was really the focus part.
What were the great residential buildings that you looked at as the model?
Of course, Walker Tower. Some of the, really, in terms of the form of the building, we really look towards the classic towers of the 20s and 30s. We're clearly huge Ralph Walker fans. We own a few of his buildings. We're actually in the process of buying another one now. So we love those buildings. We love their form. And in terms of, the residential buildings that we drew inspiration from for this building, we're really creating a new typology here with full floor units, all duplex units, with these commanding views. We really haven't seen a building like this, but I think it's more a function of the very specific nature of this assemblage in this lot and what the zoning holds. We have a landmarks approval, but from a zoning perspective, it's actually completely as of right from a zoning perspective, and we really didn't want to take the time to seek any zoning relief and expose ourselves to just a longer schedule. So we, basically designed the best, most gracious building we could under zoning constraints.
Gregg, can you talk a little bit about the dynamic of the developer and architect, and who pushed in which directions?
Yeah, we have I think we have a great relationship with JDS. We're working on several buildings together, and what's amazing about working with them is that they're willing to you could try new things, and they don't say, I'm not doing this because it's not the way it's always been done, which is what you hear a lot from.
Sometimes we should.
Probably. And they have an incredible ability to try and problem solve and look for new methods of solving those problems, and that's really fantastic. So I think they push us quite a bit. I think we push them, and I think that it's really been exciting to work on projects like this together, because I think we're both sort of young companies, and we really are trying to sort of push the limits of what can be done and what can we do materially and what can we do from financial strategies, from marketability. It's been an absolute blast to work with them.
One of the premises of the exhibition, Sky High, has a second part called The Logic of Luxury, which is not a defense of luxury housing in New York, but an argument that follows along with a book that I wrote at the beginning of my career, Form Follows Finance, which is really about commercial properties and office buildings and the highest return on investment. Michael, can you talk a little bit about the logic of luxury with the idea of how investing a little bit more may repay, and how you strategize about what is the market you're going to hit, what is the square foot price that you're going for? How does the business calculation happen?
So first of all, we like to think that any property, whether it's a tall slender building or it's a rental building in the boroughs, anything we do, we as a firm believe that if you stay focused on design first and put a little more in, you'll almost always get more out, and it's worked with us wherever we've gone. Walker Tower is a good example. It was in a sub-market in Chelsea that at the time the high end of that market was probably $1,800 to $2,000, We committed to do a no excuses renovation. It's really the finest conversion I think that's been done in the city. We really poured our heart and soul into that property. We did above and beyond what anyone else has done, hydronic radiant heat, a very elaborate facade. We spent a lot of money up front, but we achieved pricing that'll blend over $4,000 and really moved the market. And you're seeing the downtown market now, today. There are several buildings, 56 Leonard, 150 Charles, that are over $3,000 a foot. And we take full credit for moving the market there.
How much did Google's headquarters have to play in that?
We like our story better. but really, talking about the logic of luxury and what makes these buildings viable and why you're seeing them, it's a combination of the price per foot that we've seen in buildings like 157 and 432 Park and 15 Central Park West and Walker Tower. Pricing at the high end of the market is at a point where it's starting to become justifiable to do these buildings. But the truth is that there are really only very limited opportunities to do buildings like this where it'll financially pencil. And the 57th Street corridor, no pun on the pencil, the 57th Street corridor is really one of the only places where you're seeing it because of the Central Park views. In New York City, our Central Park view is like other cities' waterfront view. It's really our premier view. And with technology and wind tunnel testing and concrete strengths, these buildings are now becoming viable both financially and from an engineering perspective in a way that they weren't even 5 or 6 years ago. So I really don't think you're going to see a proliferation of these buildings in anywhere other than very premium areas because they are extremely expensive to build. The hard costs are sometimes double or even more of a more conventional building. Once you really cross the 50-story threshold, costs just go up exponentially. So I think you'll really only see these buildings on the premier corridors around Central Park.
I mean, what's amazing for us is that at these price points, JDS really challenged us to make something spectacular and something that connected with the luxury market. And so to have the ability to use beautiful materials like terracotta and bronze and really experiment with them and push the limits of what you could do, is also something that can only be done in this kind of financial model. So, some people might say, well, you just do something more traditional or whatever, but to have that sort of combination of a client that wants to push the limits of what you can do and the ability to invest in the highest quality materials is really a very special moment, as an architect to make that mark on the skyline.
I think we can take maybe 10 more minutes so we can incorporate some of the audience's questions, but let me ask Silvian for a brief comment. One question that I always want to ask about this, the subject of super slender and super tall is, to what extent is the engineering solution, the 21st century engineering solution, the reason for these buildings? Or is there something different, or what are some things different that make it possible today when it was less possible in 1990 or 1980?
Well, as we can see before, at the beginning of the 20th century, many slender buildings being built, but today we are talking about a total different environment. Number one, that we are able to check what is going to be the comfort of the user. Well, at that time or before was a guessing. Today we are quite confident that the performance of the building will be the one that even that you are in the slender building in the world, you will feel like in a regular building. And that was our primary concern and the main thing that we wanted to achieve. We wanted to get a home for somebody, not a place of a sculpture or whatever.
And that's only been possible through computer modeling and testing since when?
Well, it's starting, you didn't let me talk, but it's starting with how rigid is the building, the period of the building. So,
Right, but when did the testing come about that allowed this a change?
We work as a team, number one. We have the developer that he comes with the idea, with the wish, and with the dream. And then we have the architects that they put this dream into a shape, and then we have to make it a real one. So at that stage, then when we know the shape of the building and the usage of the building and the slenderness of the building, at that time we start working with other agency like testing within the environment, because the surrounding buildings, they impact the behavior of the building. That are many factors. At that time we start developed. It's not a process that will take one day. It's a very long process, a very meticulous process. But that's the big difference, I would say, in terms of the scientific approach that we have it today in determining a home, a structure that is a home, despite the fact that it's so slender.
Do we have some questions from the audience? And maybe Nick could run the microphone around for somebody. A hand? Are there any questions? Yeah, there's one.
It's the first time I've seen the facade of the building, which is remarkably articulated both in design and with respect to materials. That's obviously a very deliberate and intended outcome. So I'm just wondering, from a cost perspective, what the increment was for the facade that's intended over what would normally be a glass facade of this period.
I'll take that one. So first, I'll say that making that difference between what a more conventional facade would cost and what this facade costs is it's Simon Koster's job right here, sitting in the front row, to make that difference very minimal. Good luck. But in reality, there is a big cost difference. This facade would have been exotic under any condition, because the wind pressures with building this tall, the structural glazing, the curtain wall construction is very complex to begin with, and then we're hanging terracotta on it, which is not a light material. And as Gregg discussed, the profiles are up to 14 inches deep. These pieces are 3 feet tall. There's quite a bit of weight on the terracotta that has to be dealt with. The curtain wall on the 2 shear walls is probably something like a little over 2 times heavier than the normal curtain wall panel is. So there are structural implications that go with it. But the cost difference, to answer your question, at the end of the day is still to be determined, but hopefully something we can live with.
In the meantime, would you like to answer the question about what you expect to get per square foot in order to justify that extra expense?
Absolutely no problem.
Thank you. I happen to live across the street in Metropolitan Tower. I'm familiar with some of the prices 157 is getting. Do you see building these buildings future appreciation for the owner at the prices they're being sold at today?
I mean, I think I'll leave sort of long-term macroeconomic predictions to others who are much better at it, including Woody Howard, who just asked the other question. But I think that you've seen a lot of very smart investors from all around the world, titans of industry, people who have been very successful, are buying these units and they're absorbing, and they certainly feel that they're safe investments. And generally speaking, buildings that enjoy a commanding Central Park view, especially if that view is relatively protected and it's going to be around a while. Historically, those units, those apartments have held up the best, have appreciated the fastest. So if history is any indication, the units will hold their value and appreciate.
Thank you.
You should rent them and sell them later.
I have one more. Oh, thank you.
Is there anyone with their hand up and a microphone? Yes? Can't see you, but.
Hi. So the tapered design, there's going to be an upper limit to a tapered design, obviously, but if air rights were no issue, how tall could you make a building that has this small footprint? Just out of curiosity.
Technically, how tall could it go?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Sounds like we should ask Sylvia.
Let us do this building and then we'll talk.
Maybe one more question? Do we have?
Walker Tower had 14-foot and higher ceilings because of its original landlord needed that for machinery. So when you took it over, you enjoyed this amenity. And you're building with 14-foot ceilings. And it looked to me like there was a 60-foot width and looked virtually column-free. So was it just that you chose 14 feet, or was the relationship between the width and the height, a calculation to sort of make the volume of the space, relate?
No, absolutely. Ceilings can be too high, and it all depends on the scale of the room. A 14-foot ceiling in an airport feels like you're super compressed. A 14-foot ceiling in a 12 by 12 bedroom feels really awkward and too high. So absolutely, we were thinking about what the right proportion of the room was, what the sequence is when you came out of the elevator, and what you looked at to the north and the south, and what was going to give you sort of the best feel as you came into the room, and that's why we settled on 15.6 floor to floor.
Well, I want to mention one thing. When Michael came around to see the opening of the exhibition, and I pointed to 432 Park Avenue and the section of the scissor stair, switchback scissor stair, which is a 15.5-foot slab to slab height, which is one of the critical examples of the logic of luxury. It was explained to me that was the reason that you could contract this prefabricated unit. It was code that necessitated 15.5 feet, and Michael said, when I pointed to 432 Park Avenue, he said, oh yeah, we're doing that.
Yeah, frankly, the 15'6" ceiling height is going to become commonplace in the slender buildings, and there's a reason for it. When you have a smaller floor plate, you're trying to limit the core elements and how much space they take up on the floor. And by going to a 15'6" deck height, you're able to essentially put an intermediate landing on the scissor stair, on the fire stair, which shortens the overall length of the stair and allows you to free up more living space. And credit goes where credit's due. Silvian figured it out on 432 Park, and we were happy to imitate him there.
I just have one follow-up question, a quick one. I'm assuming that the ceiling height does not affect the buildable FAR, only the...
Precisely. I mean, he can answer this better, but as a historian, and the exhibition makes the point that FAR is area. And when you stretch out the height in between those floors, you're using the same area, but you're putting the eyeballs higher up into the air. And this is precisely the logic of luxury that explains the very tall and slender, super slender towers that we're seeing on 57th Street, which is justified by the $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $8,000 a square foot or more sale prices of the condominiums for sale. So, Silvian, I'm very glad that you got the key credit for this secret element that is going to become commonplace in this new building type in New York. But you don't have the microphone, and it's time to go home. It's time to go home, so let's everybody thank our speakers.